Hello students, today we will take up a new topic. This topic is under the paper Indian Economy, Unit 9, Foreign Sector. Today we will take up the new trade policy. We have discussed earlier that before reforms, India's policy about trade was quite different. There's a major shift after 1991. Earlier, we believed in import substitution. We tried to produce things that we are importing so that domestic goods could substitute the goods coming from foreign countries. And when it came to exports, we wanted to promote exports. So promotion of exports and substitution of imports was the policy that we had, the broad policy that we had before reforms period. Now after reforms period, there was a lots of liberalization in trade, and there was a marked difference where we wanted to open out to the world. Earlier we had lots of hurdles, we had lots of barriers to imports, and in the later phase, after reforms, all these barriers were removed, and this type of action is known as liberalization. So there was an attempt to remove all barriers to trade. So this is a very important and interesting aspect. Today's lecture deals with the features of the new trade policy of India. The period after 1991 has been marked by a substantial liberalization of the trade policy. While some liberalization measures were the result of the conviction among government circles that they were necessary to make exports competitive in the international market, some were undertaken under the pressure of international agencies as a part of the stabilization and structural adjustment program. So here, why such a big shift came in is also very important for us to understand. In the earlier days, it was believed that local producers should be protected from foreign goods, and therefore there were barriers to imports. But later on, a feeling came in that when the local producers are protected, they become inefficient. There is no competition, there is no motivation for them to produce at the lowest cost. And thereby, even though they have high costs, they have inefficiencies, they get away with it because they still get profits, they are protected, and all the burden falls on the consumer. So this was one argument that took place. On the other hand, international bodies also pressurized the government to give up their old policy and open out. The whole world agreed to globalization. The whole globe is to become a global village, and this was the idea that came forth. And so there were pressures also from the international bodies, and India had to join these countries and bring about reforms in their trade policy. Moreover, with India joining the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1995, as a founder member, it is under an obligation to strike down all quantitative restrictions on imports and reduce import tariffs so as to open up the economy to world trade and the forces of globalization. The main features of the new trade policy, as it has evolved over the years since 1991, can be discussed. The first feature was freer imports and exports. There was more free imports and more free exports. Even exports are sometimes were curtailed by our country earlier, because when we do not produce enough and we export our goods, that will lead to lots of hardship for our local consumers, while private producers would like to find a market where they can get higher prices and get more profits. Local consumers would suffer because of the scarcity of these goods, and again because there is scarcity, prices would rise and cause a lot of discomfort for our consumers. This feature where the government removed all restrictions on exports and imports. In the pre-reform period, India's trade policy regime was complex and cumbersome. There were different categories of importers, different types of import licenses, alternate ways of importing, etc. Substantial simplification and liberalization in all these respects has been carried out in the reform period. The tariff line wise import policy was first announced on March 31, 1996, and at that time itself 6,161 tariff lines were made free. Till March 2000, this total had gone up to 8,066. Quantitative restrictions in respect of 1,429 tariff lines remained till this date. So we can see that when we liberalize trade, the government also loses income. So government was not only regulating trade, but it was also earning some income in the form of tariffs and other fees that were charged. And now with liberalization of trade, that is the removal of all these barriers, they not only were barriers, but they were also sources of income for the government. And by removing this, trade became free, but revenue of the government also was affected to a great extent. The exempt policy 2000-2001 removed quantitative restrictions on 714 items, and the exempt policy 2001-2 removed quantitative restrictions on the balance 715 items. Thus, in line with India's commitment to WTO, quantitative restrictions on all import items have been withdrawn. So this was a very big shift. By 2002, all quantitative restrictions were removed and tariff lines did not exist now. And this, as I said earlier, not only affected the regulation of trade, but it also affected the income that the government was getting earlier. Now the second is that of tariff structure, rationalization of tariff structure. In its final report published in January 1993, Chellaya Committee had advocated drastic reductions in the import duties. The committee expressed the opinion that the rupee had depreciated considerably in the 80s and the early 90s, pushing up the level of protection to Indian industries considerably. So, in the 80s and the 90s, there was drastic fall in the rupee value compared to the dollar or foreign currency, standard foreign currency. And therefore, this fall in the rupee brought in a lot of burden on the government if it had to protect the Indian industries. So, this was another aspect. For instance, the committee pointed out that in the 7-year period 1985-86 to 1992-93, the real exchange rate of rupee had depreciated by 57.45%. This had pushed up the cost of imports considerably, leading to very high level of protection to the Indian industry. The committee therefore recommended that the prevailing import duties be rationalized drastically, lowered by 1998-99, so that parity in prices of goods produced domestically and internationally can be established. Acting on the recommendation of the committee, the government has over the years reduced the maximum rate of duty. In 1993-94, budget had reduced it from 110% to 85%. The succeeding budgets have reduced it further in stages. The peak import duty on non-agricultural goods is now only 10%. The third feature was dechannelization. A large number of exports and imports used to be channelized through public sector agencies in India. The supplementary trade policy announced on August 13, 1991 reviewed these channelized items and dechannelized 16 export items and 20 import items. So, this is also another very major consequence of what the government was trying to do. Many of the goods used to be exported and imported through the government or through its agencies. So, they were channelized through the government agencies, but now these goods were dechannelized. Now, they did not have to go through the government agencies. The goods that were dechannelized included newsprint, non-ferrous metals, natural rubber, intermediates and raw materials for fertilizers. Then the fourth feature was convertibility of the rupee on current account. The government made two-step downward adjustment of 18 to 19% in the exchange rate of the rupee on July 1 and July 3, 1991. This was followed by the introduction of partial convertibility of rupee in 1992-93. Full convertibility on the trade account in 1993-94 and full convertibility on current account in August 1994. Substantial capital account liberalization measures have also been announced in recent years. The exchange rate of the rupee is now market determined. Thus, exchange rate policy in India has evolved for the rupee being pegged to a market rate related system since March 1993. So, this was again another change where exchange rate was managed earlier by the government. It had nothing to do with the market, and only on going through a lot of pressure did they try to devalue the rupee earlier. The exchange rate is largely determined by the market, that is demand and the supply conditions. However, the Reserve Bank of India intervenes in the market to check excess volatility, prevent the emergence of speculative activity, and maintain an adequate level of exchange reserves. So, although it is market driven, intervention is called for, intervention is necessary, and RBI intervenes when there is a lots of fluctuation in the exchange rate, and whenever it finds that there is some speculation in the market which is driving up these prices, and whenever they find that speculative activities are having an adverse effect on the foreign exchange rate, then the RBI intervenes and tries to manage the situation. So, this exchange rate policy is known as managed floating. The fifth characteristic is related to trading houses. The 1991 policy allowed export houses and trading houses to import a wide range of items. The government also permitted the setting up of trading houses with 51% foreign equity for the purpose of promoting of exports. Under the 1992-97 trade policy, export houses and trading houses were provided the benefit of self-certification under the advanced license system, which permits duty-free imports for exports. The third supplement to foreign trade policy 2004-9, announced in April 2007, divided export houses into 5 categories. Export house is the first one, 2 star export house, 3 trading house, 4 star trading house, and 5 is premium trading house. The exporters were granted such status on achieving exports of rupees 20 crores, rupees 100 crores, rupees 500 crores, rupees 2,500 crores, and rupees 10,000 crores respectively. This was all an effort to increase exports. Were divided into 5 groups based upon the value of the goods that they exported. So, these export houses and trading houses have been granted a number of benefits and concessions. So, here although exports are increasing, incentives have to be given, and if some of these incentives are going to the foreigners, because 51% of the shares are held by foreigners, then there is some amount of flow out of the country, financial flow out of the country. But in order to achieve something, it is said that we have to lose something, and so the government tried to improve exports in this manner. Now, the sixth feature, special economic zones. A scheme for setting up special economic zones in the country to promote export was announced by the government on March 31, 2000. To instill confidence in investors and signal the government's commitment to a sizable cess policy regime, the Special Economic Zones Act 2005 was passed by the Parliament in May 2005. The cess Act 2005, supported by cess rules, came into effect on February 10, 2006. The main objective of CEZ Act are generation of additional economic activity, promotion of exports of goods and services, promotion of investment from domestic and foreign sources, creation of employment opportunities, and development of infrastructure facilities. We thought that the economic activity would increase because both imports and exports would increase. And if you want imports and exports to increase, then domestic and foreign investment must come in, because we know that when we export goods, we have to wait for getting the money into our country, and therefore initially a huge amount has to be invested while we wait for the money to come in. And so CEZ encouraged local investors and foreign investors, and thus the development of our country, the infrastructure of our country could be hastened with the returns that we get out of this. Now, let us summarize what we have learned up till now. We have tried to understand the features of the new trade policy. New trade policy refers to the period after 1991. There were many changes in the trade policy during this period after 1991 up to date. But on the whole, the general tendency has been to remove barriers to trade. Earlier we had many barriers to trade because we had the policy of import substitution. But now, after 1991, these barriers were gradually removed, and both the domestic and international pressures forced the government to yield and change its policy and open out to the world or to the globe, and therefore lots of liberalization to trade was granted. And we have seen the different features, the effects of such a policy on different aspects of the economy, and also we have tried to understand what are the measures that the government took up to make this policy a success. Take down some questions for self-evaluation. Question number 1: why is this period symbolized by the concept of new trade policy? The second question is, what are some of the features of the new trade policy? For references, you can refer to the latest editions of number 1, Indian Economy by Rudradath and Sundaram, published by S. Chand and Company. Number 2, Indian Economy by Mishra and Puri, published by Himalayan Publishers.